Good afternoon, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're just going to wait for people to join and get started shortly. Good afternoon. If you're just joining us, we're just going to wait another minute or two to get people joined in, and then we'll start going through. We are recording this webinar just for your reference. So if you see that while you're coming in, we are recording, and we will share that recording following the webinar as well. For those people who have joined us, you should be seeing my screen being shared. If you are not, try leaving and coming back, or adjusting any settings that you have on your computer that might be preventing that. We do expect a pretty good audience here. And as always, I think with webinars, there can be some little tricks and things along the way. So just bear with us as we get started. Again, just waiting for people to join. I'm going to give people about 1 more minute to get in here, and then we will kick off our webinar. I see a question about the slides. Yes, we will share the slides following the webinar as well. You're welcome. All right, I'm going to kick us off and get started. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. We are going to have others joining us during the meeting, I'm sure, as well. If you're hearing this, you are being recorded as well, so please be aware of that. Everybody has joined listening only, so you should have your camera and mic disabled for the moment. And I'll go over some housekeeping items to start. But you are in the New Hampshire Water and Wastewater Rates webinar, so thank you for joining us. Again, you are muted with your video disabled right now. We will have an opportunity for question and answer following our presentation today. And if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat during the presentation. We will address them at the end. There will be an opportunity also to ask questions verbally. So when we get to that point of question and answers following the presentation, I will, or one of my other webinar co-organizers will unmute you, but you also have to unmute yourself to ask a question. If you do want to ask a question verbally at that point, please use the raise hand function, which is up at the top of your Teams screen. We are recording this webinar, and that will be shared with you following the presentation today. If you do have technical difficulties, you can try to type a chat message in the box if you're having trouble hearing, or you should be seeing slides right now and seeing myself. If you are having trouble with that, put something in the chat and we can try to help you, but you might also just try leaving and coming back. That sometimes does the trick. Just to start off with some brief introductions. So I know a lot of the people that have registered today, and I really appreciate you doing so. I'm Sarah Ridyard with the Wastewater Engineering Bureau at New Hampshire DES. I'm the sustainability engineer, and I manage the asset management grant program. So I know many of you through that. I'll be joined in a minute or two here by Katie Curtis from the Drinking Water Groundwater Bureau. And I wanted to give Jaren a chance to say hello.
Hi, this is Jaren. As the financial analyst of the Wastewater Engineering Bureau at NHDES, I am currently assisting the New Hampshire municipalities with their sewer rates by providing them with the necessary knowledge, financial analysis regarding the rates, rate studies. Do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaron. We also have Matt Detterling from the Drinking Water Groundwater Bureau here as well. So those are the DES staff we have on the call. And again, our experts from RefTelis are here, and I will introduce them right before they speak. Before we do that, I did just want to go over a couple of things. This webinar is a new topic for us to be, providing some information on, and we do want to encourage municipalities to consider financial sustainability in their water infrastructure. So that's where the rates come in to be able to plan for the future. We have some resources that are helpful, so I just wanted to go over that to begin with. And again, as Jaron mentioned, she's available for support, particularly on the wastewater rate side. One of the resources we have that a lot of you are familiar with is our asset management grant program. We have a web page devoted to that. There's a QR code here. If you're tech savvy and want to pull out your smartphone and hold it up with the camera to the screen, you can get right to that web page. Or also the link is at the bottom of this page as well. We have a lot of resources on there. Asset management is kind of the foundation to getting some of that financial planning in place for the future. Another resource that we offer at DES is what we call our rates dashboard. So this is for water and sewer rates throughout the state. We have the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center help us put this together, and it's a great way to look at a lot of the data around the state for current water and wastewater rates. It helps compare to neighboring communities of similar size, or just see the variation across the state as well. So another QR code there if you want to try that out. Also, the link is available too, and it's updated on an annual basis, so it's pretty current, the information that we publish there. Another thing I want to mention, and you may have received one or more emails from me or someone else at DES about this, but we do want to get the word out about our asset management workshop for water infrastructure on October 30th. This is a in-person workshop at the National Guard facility in Pembroke, New Hampshire. And it's a great day. If you've attended in the past, it's a good time to meet some of your colleagues from around the state who are working on asset management for their water systems. All ranges of experience are welcome. So we have, things for people who are beginners all the way up to experts. And I did want to mention Dave and Toby from RefTelis will be providing a presentation at that workshop. So if you hear something today that you want to follow up on, that would be a great chance to see them in person. I'll turn it over to Katie, who wanted to mention some of the drinking water funding.
Hi, yes. My name is Katie Curtis, and as Sarah mentioned earlier, I'm the Asset Management Coordinator for the Drinking Water Bureau. And I just want to let you all know that the Water System Sustainability Grant Program is now accepting applications for asset management and strategic planning grants. These grants are available to drinking water systems serving a population of 150 or more, and that's number of people served, not service connections. We're offering a maximum of $30,000 for new asset management programs and $20,000 for improvements to existing asset management programs. So for example, if you've come in for an asset management grant in the past and you're looking to advance or add on to your program, you can apply for this. Financial reviews are eligible for funding as well if you're interested, especially after listening to this webinar. We are also offering a strategic planning grant with a maximum award of $30,000 for preliminary engineering or hydrogeological studies to obtain the best available data to implement water system improvements. So all these grants require a match of 50% of the awarded grant amount. So if you're awarded $30,000, you would need to match with $15,000. And applications are accepted until November 15th.
Thanks, Katie. So with that, we're ready to introduce our speakers. For anyone who joined us while we were doing the intro, I just wanted to mention again, we will have time for questions following the presentation. You can feel free to use the chat box to put in those questions in writing, and I will facilitate them at the end. Also, once we reach the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity where if you'd like to raise your hand and ask your question verbally, we'll offer you that chance. So you'll use that raise hand function, which is at the top of your Teams screen. And then one of us will unmute you, and you also have to unmute yourself. Just be aware there will be an opportunity for questions, and we're excited to get started. So I'll start with Toby. Toby Fetter has over 25 years of experience in the civil and environmental engineering and financial management industries. And for the past 15 years, his professional work has centered on the provision of financial advice to communities dealing with public infrastructure financing. So we're glad to have Toby join us, as well as Dave Fox. Dave has over 13 years of experience in water and wastewater utility, financial, and rate consulting. He has worked with water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities on a variety of studies, and he leads Raftelis's New England office based in Natick, Massachusetts. So welcome, Dave and Toby, and I will stop sharing and turn it over to you two.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Give me just a second here. Somebody tell me they can see this okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Dave Fox with Raftelis. Toby Federer is with me as well. I'm a little sick at the moment, so I apologize in advance for you having to listen to this awful voice I have going on. But thankfully, Toby's here to pick up a little bit of the slack, and then we'll just make sure he answers all your questions that you're going to have at the tail end of this. What we're trying to do here is hopefully I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. I'm going to turn it over to Toby and then back to me at the tail end of the presentation. We're trying to distill down an entirety of a rate study in about a 45-minute to an hour presentation, which is really difficult to do. So we're going to just try to hit the high points of what we think is important of a rate study, things like financial planning or financial sufficiency, identifying how much money you need to be generating on an annual basis to not only keep up with operations, but also improve routine renewal and replacement, regulations, upgrades to maintain continuity of service for customers. Toby's going to go through that. We also want to talk a little bit about kind of a second iteration of a rate study, which is kind of a rate design. So once we discover through the financial planning process how much money we need to generate on an annual basis, we could sometimes ask the question, how should we be recovering those revenues through different rate designs and rate structures and policies, and what are the common things we've been hearing, particularly New Hampshire as well as New England, and really nationwide from a lot of our customers. We're going to go through a couple of just real high-level case studies to present some of the core things that we hear from the vast majority of our clients and how those things are being addressed and how rates can be designed and things to be thinking about. And then get into a few slides on once you get to the tail end of a rate study, how do we communicate that to the public? Communicate that to the decision makers, whether that be a select board or a city council or a board of water commissioners, whoever's making the decisions on whether these rates get approved or not, as well as the ratepayers and the residents. We want to make sure we're communicating as often as possible, as well as just some kind of year-round routine communication, which can just help with those discussions that you need to have. Rate study process, we start on the bottom of this pyramid here, really identifying the financial and pricing objectives. I'm going to touch more on this in terms of those pricing objectives, what's important to the community. Obviously, financial sufficiency is the core one, which Toby's going to get into in the next few slides. He'll then go over step 2, which is identifying the revenue requirements or the costs. So we can outline a financial plan and a financial projections of how are revenues currently meeting your obligations today, and how do we think that's going to change over time? We sometimes go through a process then of allocating costs. We're not going to touch on that much today. Most New England communities aren't going through very robust cost allocation studies, mostly because they're expensive and time consuming. They're very data intensive. They're not really necessary. Some of the regulated utilities across New Hampshire are required to do those. But most municipal entities aren't getting into cost allocations, but I'll touch on it a little bit when I get into my rate design section. From that, once we identify all of your costs, we can design different rate structures and understand what the impacts are to customers. Are they identifying, are they achieving what our objectives are? And then step 5 is rolling it all together and kind of bringing it back down to step 1. And we went through this whole process. is what we've come up with. Do we think that's going to actually address our pricing objectives, address our financial needs, or do we need to go back to the drawing board? We always want to check things and make sure that we're accomplishing the goals, or at least feel very confident that we're accomplishing those goals as much as possible prior to the implementation of any rate plan or rate design change that you might have. So with that being said, I'm going to pause here for a little bit and turn it over to Toby to walk you through the financial planning process.
Sure. So thank you very much for having me, Sarah. As Dave indicated, I'm going to just sort of walk through the financial planning process as it applies to utilities and try and, I guess, share sort of why we do it, what the what the plan is, walk through some of the components of a plan, take a look at projections, and then also talk a little bit about resources. So thanks for switching, Dave. So really, financial planning 101. These goals are common to pretty much all utilities, public or private. Basically, the primary goal is to ensure that the utility is going to have adequate funding to achieve its long-term sustainability. And that's honestly, that includes both sort of the financial side, but also it includes on the technical side, because a lot of utilities right now are dealing with an expansion of sort of the bandwidth of regulations that are applying. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But really, the primary categories that are included in this group of the things we're funding are the operating expenses and debt service. And that's what it is that it costs a utility to operate. And this applies equally to both water and sewer utilities, as does pretty much everything I'm going to talk about. But really, what does it cost to keep the lights on and keep staff coming and stay in compliance with all of your permits? And what does it cost to pay for the debt service, which is really, to put it into sort of kitchen table speak, it's really sort of the mortgage payment. It's the things you've borrowed in the past in order to build and what you need to repay on that. It's the ability to pay for needed future capital improvements for either new requirements or growth, depending upon how your utility finances those items. A big one that we're going to touch on fairly heavily later on is really the asset renewal and replacement. I think it is where a huge amount of the assets that are providing the services for utilities are buried and I think not well understood. The fact of the matter is usually the vast majority of replacement value of any utility is in the horizontal assets. That's either the distribution system in the case of water or in the collection system in the case of wastewater system. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about sort of cash management and cash reserves policies and how you use those to mitigate risks. Talk a little bit about how all of these things can play into bond and loan covenants and the maintenance of credit ratings, which, as Dave indicated, may not apply to a huge number of the folks on the call, but it's an important consideration for a very large percentage of the utilities. So we'll be taking those items. We'll be walking through the process of how you identify a strategy to handle capital investments, and then within the actual financial planning process, how you have the ability to actually look at timing and terms and the way that we finance various projects. And then really coming out of the financial plan, the goal is to have a very good idea of the amount of revenue that we're actually looking for our rates, which Dave will be talking about, to generate on a year-to-year basis to ensure the long-term, fiscal position of the utility. So with that, go ahead, Dave. Okay, so what are the benefits? Obviously, not running out of money, that's the sort of the writ large portion, but basically the other benefits that come along this is you go through the process of looking at all of your costs, looking at how they're going to play out over time and having defensible estimates. And usually this is something that I think a lot of utilities have a sense of, but is not well understood outside of the utilities. And by doing the financial planning process, you actually end up with a very good communication tool that helps play into the larger discussion on rates and things along those lines. The second benefit is it really allows a utility to assess the different approaches that you might have, whether that be changes or differences in timing or differences in the funding mechanisms, which if you don't have any sense of, well, what is this going to cost from an actual, how the dollars meet your annual budgets sense, of, let's say you have a capital project which needs the installation of a significant upgrade to your treatment plant. Usually the top line number on that is enough to scare pretty much everyone. And with the financial plan, you can actually see, well, what does that project actually mean to us from an operating economics standpoint? The third benefit, as I said, it really helps you express what the expectations are to everyone who's going to be interested in the later processes of rate setting and getting buy-in from the folks who we need to convince, we're providing a valuable service, and we do need the revenue that's needed to actually be able to do what the law requires. So in the end, the benefits, you end up with a financially sustainable approach to overall management. And it really, by going through the financial planning process, you end up in a position where your utility not only understands what things are going to cost, but really correctly enters into the discussion about how we're going to be setting rates such that they are targeted to provide necessary revenue. So go ahead, Dave. Okay, so financial planning, as we alluded to earlier, it's really a fairly straightforward process of developing a rational projection of what your finances are going to look like for years into the future. And as the figure on the right expresses, it really sort of takes all of the things that impact utilities' finances, from the dollars going out the door to the financial policies to the way that you bring in revenue. It takes them all in and puts them into a single location that allows you to really examine things and understand how they interplay with one another. And so, for example, on the O&M or on the expense side, you've got the O&Ms. That's pretty straightforward, and we'll be taking a look at all of these components in greater detail in later slides. But you're taking a look at your reserves and contributions you may be making to them or drawing from them. You're taking a look at basically all of the capital investments that you need to do, and that's going to be both within a CIP, and we'll talk more about that, but then also in making sure that when we agree on the financial plan, we also are accounting for what asset renewal and replacement should be, at least from a high level standpoint. Making sure that your existing asset renewal and replacement programs are likely to be able to keep pace with the degradation of existing assets. We'll take a look at some of the financial policies and talk about those a little bit later in the presentation. Then we'll talk a little bit about revenues, and that's really going to be Dave is going to be mostly addressing that. But what the financial plan will do is it will really allow us to understand how sufficient are our existing revenue streams in comparison to what we believe are likely to be our costs going forward. So with that, go ahead, Dave. Okay, and so really the important inputs into any financial plan, they're your budgets, and I include both adopted and actual budgets. Of the adopted ones are your current budget. The actuals are prior year's budgets where you've actually closed out the year, and in most cases have some form of audited financials available that really show you, well, whatever the budget was, this is what we actually spent on the actual provision of service. And the use of those two things can basically lead through the application of adjustment factors for future years to a pretty reasonable expectation for what we think O&M costs are going to be. Debt service schedules. A lot of utilities, a surprising number, actually don't have a consolidated location where they understand, okay, well, what what does the repayment schedules look like for all of the loans that we have outstanding right now? And really, so part of this process is taking a look at the existing notes that are, that are going to be paid by the utility, and really developing a payment schedule that plays into the financial plan. And then taking a look at the capital programs and understanding, okay, and as I said earlier, you may have a new treatment plant, or you may need to replace 2 miles of pipe per year based on your estimates, making sure that those types of costs, including when they're going to happen and how you're going to finance them, are correctly built into the financials for the utility. And then one additional thing that we generally do, or that I generally do, is I like to see an asset inventory to the extent that they exist. Sometimes they aren't perfectly developed for a lot of systems, but they don't necessarily need to be, to make sure that you are correctly targeting your asset renewal and replacement goals. And so with that, go ahead and go forward one. Really, the modeling considerations that go into this, because in the end, the financial plan is a form of financial modeling, is, we take the O&M costs, as I said, and we escalate them into future years. And usually we usually go a minimum of 5 years, oftentimes as far as 10 on many of these components. We take a look at your existing debt fund or debt service for your funds. I refer to enterprise fund here. I recognize not all utilities on the call probably operate as enterprise funds, but I suspect many do. And that will come directly out of budgets and town documentation, usually from the finance office. We take a look at your capital improvements, and honestly, generally speaking, the manager of the utilities are usually they have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done, but taking the plans that they need to do and then actually fleshing them out with timing and terms and financing methodology, that goes in. And then really understanding, what's going to be available from things. So whether you're going to issue a GO bond, and that's a general obligation bond of a municipality, but oftentimes these things can be done through SRFs or through some of the other funding programs. And we'll touch on that a little bit at the end too. So go ahead, Dave. Okay, so really the first piece, this is the O&M piece, and this is where we begin the process of building out a financial plan. And probably this is just a sample operations budget, but it probably looks fairly recognizable to virtually everyone on the call. This is your annual budget that for municipal utilities, you go through the annual budgeting process, usually in the early springtime, and you say, well, this is what we spent last year's. And for O&M, oftentimes there's escalations that need to account for, everything from union contracts to changes in headcount, depending on changes at the utility. But this is really where we build all of those things in. We start with your existing budget, we escalate that, and then we step back and we say, does this include everything? So for example, let's say you have a new treatment plant that you're going to be building in your CIP that we'll talk about in a moment. You also want to be taking a look at, well, that's going to come online in fiscal 27. And presumably, there is some level of understanding of what that cost would be when it comes online. You want to include those. Once the plant's going to be operating, we want the financial plan to include everything. And so as conditions for your utility change, we want to make sure the O&M budgets are changing appropriately to account for that. Now, the second one, that's the table at the bottom. That's a pretty straightforward, very simple table of debt service. And as I said, this is the debt repayment on loans that the utility's already taken out. You want to have this, honestly, I recommend clients know what these are all the way to all of the bond maturities. And that's really the first two pieces that go into the financial plan. And go ahead, Dave. And then the next big piece, and usually it's the one that drives a lot of the concern for utilities, is capital planning. And this can be capital due to the needs for growth. It can be capital due to new regulatory requirements. It can be capital due to, existing, you understand that you have so many breaks per mile and you want to replace certain cohorts. And again, I've included a sample CIP here that probably will look somewhat similar to something that virtually everyone on the call has looked at before. And it's really here's what we think we need to do. And this one obviously is for water. Well, the top is for water, the bottom is for sewer. But these are the projects that we need to do. And the important thing, or the things that really need to be included and considered when you're trying to build out a defensible financial plan, are you need what the current construction cost is. And I know those have spiraled a lot lately, but we want to basically make sure that whatever it would cost to build today, that's one of the base metrics we need for every single project, or the best estimate you have. You need to have an understanding, the second key point there of the three critical components of when it's going to be needed, meaning when you need it to be constructed and online. And so for certain communities, you might be dealing with maybe a PFAS upgrade that's needed. And we obviously have now a regulatory deadline in order to comply with those. If you have upgrades that are needed to comply with NIPD's permits on the wastewater side, obviously those have usually implementation standards as well. We want to make sure that we're financing everything in a way and planning for it in a way that allows us to meet compliance deadlines. And so really assigning the costs to the years in which we think they're going to be incurred. And then the third critical component, when you're actually trying to take this list of projects and figure out, well, what is the actual financial hit to the utility? The third critical piece is having an understanding of how you think the utility plans to pay for that. And, the important thing here is, if a utility comes to us and says, well, we have a $10 million project and we aren't sure how we're going to finance it. Obviously, that can look incredibly different from a year-to-year basis, depending on how you finance it. So $10 million out the door in a single year is a big challenge. But if you were to finance, a project through, say, an SRF, that's state revolving fund. In most states right now, an SRF loan for $10 million is going to actually, the way it ends up hitting your budget is around a $630,000 to $650,000 annual debt service coverage, assuming no debt forgiveness, which is something else that plays into this. And really coming out of this process, we just end up with a rational cash flow for everything associated with the capital program. Go ahead, Dave. Okay, this is sort of the next thing that I referred to as making sure, this area I think has traditionally not gotten as much attention as it's going to need in the years to come, but it's basically truth testing your pipe replacement budgets. I've seen utilities where the horizontal infrastructure was 85 to 95% of the overall replacement value of the system. Everyone thinks of plants and pump stations and things along those lines as being the most expensive assets. But from the standpoint of actually, occasionally replacing all of the assets in the system, the vast majority for most utilities, especially utilities that own their own treatment plants and are not part of a larger regionalized approach, the vast majority of your assets and the cost of replacing them is in things that don't get a lot of scrutiny oftentimes. And so the way that I often recommend that people take a look at this is you begin with what your installed networks look like. You overlay some, and this is really from the top within the figures. The top left that's an installed mileage of pipe for a client where we did this exact same exercise. We overlay basically pipe failure probability curves based upon industry estimates and how long we would expect different pipe classes to live. And really what comes out of that, the important piece is the chart on the bottom. And what the chart on the bottom shows you is in blue, it shows you, well, if you are going to be, fully catching up for deferred replacement, it really spits out here's how many miles per year you should be doing. And this is really a really good tool for just comparing against, oftentimes within your CIP, you'll have pipe replacement or things along those lines. somewhere within the CIP, it's a really good comparison point against whatever your plans are, because it can help identify situations where utilities are not doing enough horizontal asset replacement and renewal, and which eventually will box you into a corner. But at the bottom, the two different lines, the blue is the mileage, which you see on the left-hand scale, and then the yellow is basically a presumed budgeting amount. And these are things that I said are really good for comparison against your CIP to make sure that your financial plan reflects reality. So go ahead, Dave. Okay, and then this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. And again, this is a hypothetical water capital improvement plan, but this is the type of output that you would be expecting from one of these. And what this ends up showing you is, on an annualized basis, for the set of projects and funding assumptions that went into this particular analysis, you end up with what you would expect for the annual cash going out the door in both basically cash finance capital as well as new debt service. And so you can see in this case, you're going from a fiscal 24 budget of somewhere around 600,000 over the next 10 years up to, really, the expectation would be around $3.2 million in spending that will need to be directly, or will need to be recovered in order for your financial plan to be able to accomplish all of the upgrades and such that are needed. So go ahead. I realize I'm running a little bit long here. Sarah already covered this one, but I did want to highlight the asset management, which will give you a much more in-depth look at asset management, is on October 30th. And definitely just want to shout out to DES and recommend you guys consider either involving yourselves with it or at least taking a look at the materials available online. Go ahead, Dave. Okay, and then asset management risk mitigation. Honestly, it is a key risk mitigation because it makes sure you don't end up in a position that we've seen many utilities get to in the past, where they neglect R&R, they neglect other assets, and they end up basically getting painted into a corner simply because assets are failing at a faster rate than they're able to replace them within any rational adjustment of their overall revenue picture. And so it allows you to basically make sure your CIP expenditures are right. And it also gives you a good idea of what your cash reserves should look like in light of the risk profile that comes out of an asset management, a more formal asset management planning exercise. Go ahead, Dave. Okay, and so this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. This is a sample financial plan desktop. Really, at the top are tables. You don't need to look into them too much, but really what it does is, this is where we combine the various aspects that we looked at. Those are the different cost categories. So you'll see in the chart at the left at the bottom, you have basically a stack bar format. We have O&M, we have existing debt. In this case, they were a customer of a regional provider, and so we have an expectation for what their payment to the regional utility provider is going to be. And then onto that, we've overlaid for this customer indirect costs, which were accounted for separately. But the thing that's nice about this, and this is where the communication tool comes in, is we compare what we expect over the course of the next 10 years against their average of the last three revenue cycles, their average revenue generation. That's the black dotted line. And again, it's the same chart on the bottom right on the capital that's implied in this program, but it gives you this concise and fairly obvious way of communicating the need for rate increases at the same time as actually showing what we want the rates to be designed to generate from a revenue perspective. Go ahead. And then this is a different financial dashboard. We set these up in different ways for different communities, and honestly, different communities all want something different. But in this case, we're taking a look at everything from your debt service coverage to your projected ending balances, which can oftentimes be a very pointed driver on rate increases if you're going to be running into the negative on fund balance. Obviously, communities generally don't like to cover deficits, and at least in an enterprise fund situation, that can be required. But again, similar output or basically similar idea to the prior set, just a different presentation. And go ahead, Dave. And this is really just the one thing is when you get into scenario analysis, and that's really about scenario analysis is about moving around the timing in terms of capital in most cases. Many of the other things are not as movable or as manageable as the timing in terms of your capital program, but it really gives you some metrics once you do a financial plan that can show you, well, look, if we roll out a capital program or if we do asset renewal and replacement on a cash finance basis, and you build those assumptions into your financial plan, you automatically get these generations. So for example, on the right-hand side, you see that exact situation I was referring to, which is a water fund ending up in the red over the course of the next 5 years without revenue adjustments. Again, these are all tools that just help make sure that everyone's on the same page when you get into the somewhat more contentious process of talking about rates. So finalization and refinement of the plan. Again, this is, you want to take a look at your ops budgets to make sure, if for communities dealing with PFAS, we've dealt with Cape Fear Water, who you probably have all heard of. And I know that, for example, they had to very significantly change some of their operating budget assumptions around public outreach and such. There are other things that are playing into your operating budgets that you'll want to be taking account of. It's LCR, new emerging contaminants, and other reporting requirements. And then, as I said, when you get into finalization of the plan, you're looking at the availability of funding. You don't want to make the assumption that SRF funds are going to be available if they aren't going to be available to you, because the cash flow that comes out of a general obligation bond is usually somewhat less favorable than communities using SRF. And then the timing and the financing. So, and again, by having the financial plan that we were looking at earlier, it just allows you to compare what the picture looks like against revenue generation. So thank you, Dave. Go ahead. And just so everyone knows, quick note on basically debt financing. Obviously, debt financing is borrowing to build things that are big. The advantages are it's in the short term, it is cheaper, and it can be massively cheaper than cash financing. It does, to the way that a lot of people think of fairness, it provides a level of sort of equity between current and future customers, and has much smaller rate impact. And as I did allude to, especially on the SRF and some of the federal dollars right now, certain programs can contain provisions for debt forgiveness, which to my ears sounds exactly like a grant. And those are dollars that you can spend that you won't need to repay. And that's a good thing. Debt financing, obviously, you do end up paying financing charges, a little bit more expensive. And oftentimes over the long term, in absolute dollars, it's more expensive. Not always. I know folks who did large bond issuances back in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, right before the spike in construction costs and very low rates. And almost certainly in real dollar terms, they'll pay far less for the assets they built in that timeframe than would be the case if they did now. So go ahead, Dave. Useful financial policies that utilities may want to think about having: operations, ways of dealing with expansion and repair and replacement. These are things that the more written policies you have, the easier your conversation is going to be. And then also, if many utilities outside of New England actually have debt finance policies where they talk about maximum debt service coverage ratios, they have to maintain certain bond covenants and bond ratings. All those things play in, and the more guidance you have from your stakeholders on these, the more accurate and I think more defensible the financial plan is. Go ahead. And then one quick slide. Y'all may just want to do a screen cap or get the presentation afterwards. But honestly, your funding opportunities right now for For cheapest is SRF, the Buy America, Build America, which has lots of limitations, but can be useful in certain cases. And then I provided a bullet list. Actually did a water infrastructure funding workshop this spring. I believe most of those resources are still available in case you're looking to improve your knowledge there. And then the guidance on capital financing, which is really about going out to market to finance these things. The AWWA M29 manual right now is probably sort of the definitive work, although there are some others from WEF and such. I think with that, Dave, I'll hand it over to you. I apologize for running a little long.
That's all right. Thanks, Toby. Appreciate that. Let's talk a little about rate design. So just to recap, what Toby just went through, just to distill this down at a basic level, the financial planning process allows you to look over a short and long-term period. Typically, we like to look at the next 5 years. Sometimes, as Toby mentioned, we'll go out to about 10 years. But it allows you to identify how much revenue needs to get generated every single year to be able to support not only your existing operating expenses, your existing debt service, but also one of the key drivers, the renewal and replacement of infrastructure and your capital improvements plan. So how much money needs to get generated? Now, what a lot of communities do at this point in time is just say, okay, we know how much additional revenue we need. We know how much revenue we're generating currently. We can just do across the board increases, say 6% increases to our rates every single year, maintaining the same rate structure. But what we hear a lot from our clients and a lot of communities is that financial sufficiency, although the paramount goal, the overarching goal, is not the only goal, especially when we're talking about the need for additional rate increases to customers. We hear a lot of things about affordability. We hear about revenue stability a lot. So what I want to talk about now is just kind of some of those ancillary objectives that communities are mostly concerned about. This is not going to be exhausting, but it's going to be 90% of the communities we work with. What are we hearing from them that are their key concerns with regard to rate design or ancillary objectives other than financial sufficiency? So what we want to walk through, I'm going to give a couple case studies, just very high level, not getting into too much detail. Some of the common things we hear, understand how those different pricing objectives or those ancillary goals can impact what a community does in terms of rate design, how those objectives can compete with one another, and how we can align the rates to best accomplish those objectives, while at the same time maintaining that financial sufficiency that's required to be able to meet all obligations of operating expenses, debt service, cash funded capital, things like that. So why would you want to align your rates with that strategic plan? Well, a lot of times communities have overarching goals, things like we want to make sure that we have a community that is affordable for all residents. Sometimes we see communities that are encouraging economic development. Other times we see communities who have a supply issue in terms of water supply during certain periods of the year. So you can think of a community that is very seasonal based, has a lot of people coming into their jurisdiction over the summer months, for example, and there's a huge spike in water. There's a lot of times a supply related issue there. There's also an equity related issue. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. We can use our rate design, not just those across the board increases, but we can potentially make changes to the rates themselves, the structure of how you're charging your customers to align with those strategic objectives. How can we create a rate structure that enhances affordability for customers of maybe a certain group? How can we align our rate structure to promote economic development or to incentivize conservation or to ensure that year-round customers are not subsidizing seasonal customers? We can't do all those things together perfectly. I'll talk about that. There's going to obviously be some competing objectives, but working through this process, we can try to understand what is the best rate structure for our community. And that starts with understanding what those pricing objectives are. So what are some common pricing objectives? The top two on this kind of scale here, revenue stability and affordability, this is what we hear more often than not, is we want a stable revenue stream. predominantly due to volatility in consumption. So if you think of a water or sewer utility that is entirely based on their revenues, entirely based on a volumetric revenue stream that is contingent upon how much water a customer is using or how much collectively your customers are using. In periods of time where you have a very cool, wet spring, summer, fall, consumption declines accordingly. If your entire revenue stream is based on volume used, we can see significant swings downward in consumption during those periods, and that directly impacts your revenue that you're bringing in the door. So when we're establishing that financial plan, there's a lot of volatility that can come. It can go the other way as well, but a lot of communities are trying to mitigate that fluctuation and have a more stable revenue stream. So when they're issuing new debt, they're reinvesting in their capital infrastructure, they ensure that they're making enough, or they're generating enough revenue to pay for all those things. And then affordability, of course, it's been one of the hottest topics in the industry that we've heard over the last 5 to 10 years, as water and sewer bills have increased more than twice the rate of inflation over the last 20 years. Affordability is at the forefront of everybody's minds, especially the powers that be, or the politicians or the decision makers who are approving or not approving rate increases. They're very cognizant of the impact that this is having, especially on economically disadvantaged customers. And so we hear very often, we can't do anything. We can't increase rates because of affordability issues. Well, there are some things we can do from a rate design perspective to perhaps mitigate some of those impacts, because not increasing rates is not the option. It's going to lead to quality concerns for water and sewer, reliability concerns, not meeting regulatory compliance. Those things is not good for the community as a whole. So there are things we can try to do with regard to rate design to mitigate those impacts on customers, while at the same time the community or the utility can generate the money that it needs. Some of the things we hear are equity and economic development, and we'll get into some of those. So let's start first with kind of a high-level case study. This is a water system. It could be a sewer system as well. A small to medium-sized utility or community. I think the vast majority of folks on this call fit into that category. This is overall an economically distressed community with a disproportionate number of households that are economically disadvantaged. And there's a desire to not burden those customers as much. They also have a lot of infrastructure needs. So there's a need for additional revenue to pay for that reinvestment in the infrastructure, but a desire not to have it mitigate or impact customers to the greatest degree possible, because it is very economically disadvantaged. So this community, and again, I said this before, very common to hear this, and I'm sure a lot of people are shaking their heads. Yes, this fits into what we're hearing, is affordability and revenue stability are the two primary goals outside of revenue sufficiency. Doing something to not hurt as much as possible economically disadvantaged customers, but maintain revenue stability so that you're able to generate revenue stably on an annual basis to pay for those additional operating expenses, those additional capital costs. So one of the ways that we can address revenue stability is through higher fixed charges. So a higher percentage of your revenue coming from fixed charges. That unfortunately tends to fly directly in the face of affordability. So let's talk about that for a second. So if we were to reduce the magnitude of existing fixed charges, so potentially reduce the percentage of revenue coming from fixed charges versus volumetric, that has a positive impact on low to typical volume residential customers, which is more often than not the group of customers that communities are concerned about. So you can see on the left here, this is a very common rate structure, a fixed charge based on meter size that escalates to reflect the additional capacity. And I'll talk about this in more detail in just a little bit. On the right here, this is an industry-wide water bill comparison of the distribution of the bill components, variable, so volumetric, versus fixed. So a 0 CCF for a no volume customer whatsoever, 100% fixed, of course. But as you go from a 5 CCF customer, you can see it's about a 50-50 split of what's made up from fixed and volumetric. But as you get to higher consumption, so double that 10 CCF, that fixed charge drops to about 30% rather than 50%. So this is disproportionately, I would say, we do a lot of billing analysis for our customers, our clients, and 4 to 5 CCF per month is typically the median residential consumption that we see. There's some volatility to that, but that's a pretty standard. So that's your typical residential customer there on the middle part of this chart. And it can be made up about 50% of their fixed charge of their bill as a fixed charge, which they have no ability to control whatsoever because it is such fixed. So even if they conserve, they're only reducing the 50% of their charge that's variable. Whereas a 10 CCF customer, only 30% of their bill is made up by that fixed. It doesn't impact them as much as it does a typical volume, or certainly a low volume. If we looked at like a 2 to 3 CCF customer, which is a lot of times presented to us as the little old lady on a fixed income, right? Not having to overburden her. Those fixed charges can do that. So a reduction in the amount of revenue collected from those fixed charges can have a positive impact. I said before, the revenue stability and the affordability fly directly in the face of one another. They conflict. And the reason for that is if we reduce the amount of revenue you're collecting from fixed charges, that reduces your revenue stability. That revenue that you're getting from fixed charges does not fluctuate as consumption fluctuates. So it's very revenue stable. And it's the reason we've been seeing over the last, over a decade or so, fixed charges becoming higher and higher is because of that revenue stability. As communities are seeing the volatility in consumption and they're needing additional revenue, they want that revenue to be predictable and stable and trustworthy. And by having more and more of your revenue coming from fixed charges, it's able to do that. So we've been actually seeing an inclining trend in the percentage of revenue coming from fixed charges, and coincidentally, a declining trend in volumetric. Now, so if we were to reduce the magnitude of existing fixed charges, again, benefits are all of your customers, especially those who we think we are most concerned about, that typical to low volume residential customer, gives them a greater ability to reduce their bill by conserving. It puts more of the onus on the backs of the very high volume customers who are using more. But what this does is it can, again, reduce your revenue stability. And it can also have some cost recovery issues. If you're not generating enough revenue on an annual basis and there's more volatility coming from that volumetric or that consumption-based revenue stream, again, that can really limit your ability to have predictable revenue to reinvest in the system the way that you need to. One way that you can counter this, and Toby touched on it a bit with regard to reserve fund balances. So when we think of financial viability or health or revenue stability, one way is through fixed charges. But if we're having a tough time getting those fixed charges passed because of the impact on low to typical volume residential customers from an affordability standpoint, one thing you can do is have a higher reserve fund balance to mitigate the fluctuation or the potential fluctuation in revenue from year to year. So if you have more revenue more dollars sitting in a reserve fund, a rainy day fund, or a rate mitigation fund, if you do have one of those down years in terms of revenue because consumption was down, you have some money sitting in a fund that you can be financially flexible and offset that in that year, assuming that it doesn't, continue in perpetuity. You have some monies there to be able to maintain your financial sufficiency and keep your financial flexibility, so you're not having to deviate significantly from your financial plan. But that's a double-edged sword as well, because it helps with the financial health. But in order to get more money in a reserve fund, you have to increase rates more than you need in terms of your revenue requirements. So a lot of things to think about. Another thing that can be done, especially for those communities who have I would say a flat fixed charge. So you saw earlier, and I'll just flip back quickly. On the left side, this is very standard. It's based on industry best practices of scaling your fixed charge based on meter size. So a 4-inch customer is going to pay more than a 5/8 inch customer. Vast majority of your customers, I would imagine, are 5/8 inch or 3/4, somewhere in that range. It's putting more on the onus on the backs of the larger customers, which aligns better with cost of service to reflect the capacity needed to serve those larger customers. So one of the things you can think about as a community, if you're trying to mitigate the impact on those 5/8 inch, those small to typical volume residential customers, while at the same time enhance your revenue stability. Some of the things you can do is, especially for those communities that have a flat fixed charge, so it does not escalate by meter size, think about escalating that by meter size, because you can recover the exact same amount of revenue you're covering today, or potentially even more. But you're going to recover more from those larger meter sizes and not impact your smallest residential customers or your typical residential customers as much. And that directly aligns with cost of service. It directly aligns with industry best practices of doing so. And again, it can be a way to kind of mitigate that impact to that low volume customer, that typical volume customer, while at the same time not having to give up your revenue stability, those fixed charges of scaling. Now, there are I would say the most predominant or common method of scaling fixed charges is using AWWA ratios or equivalency ratios based on flow for meter sizes. We have implemented some other things where we look at the actual community's average consumption by meter size and scaling it that way. So you'd look at a year's worth of billing data. How much more does a 4-inch customer use on average than a 5/8-inch customer? And then you would scale the fixed charge such that, say it was 20 times, your 4-inch charge would be 20 times more than your 5/8-inch charge. And you could scale that for all of your meter sizes. Again, allowing you to maintain some of your revenue stability by having the revenue coming from fixed charges, while at the same time mitigating the impact to the customers who most decision makers are going to be concerned about. Another thing that can be done, which doesn't really enhance revenue stability, but certainly can be a tool in the toolbox for addressing affordability concerns, especially for low to typical volume customers, is to implement an inclining block rate structure. So this is the more you use as you step through tranches of usage, the more you're going to pay per unit. So in this example, for the first tier, for 0 to 4,000 gallons per month, a customer would pay $2 per 1,000 gallons for the first 4,000 gallons. And then for every 1,000 gallons above that 4,000, a customer would pay $4 per 1,000 gallons. Now, this gives an essential amount of usage for a residential customer at a lower volumetric rate to help with that affordability standpoint. It puts the onus more on the backs of the higher volume customers. And you could see here 2 examples, one with a uniform volumetric rate. A customer, all residents would pay $5 per 1,000 gallons for all of their consumption. And on the right side, we have $3 for the first 1,000 gallon or first 4,000 gallons per 1,000 gallon, and then $6.50 for everything above that. And you can see a water bill at 6,000 gallons on the left, where it's a uniform rate. That monthly bill would be $30, where on the right side, where we have the inclining block rate structure, that water bill would be $25. So this is a tool in the toolbox to be able to offset the need for significant bill increases if we are increasing fixed charges in tandem, or at least leaving fixed charges where they are, to try to benefit those customers we're most concerned about. And one way you can think about this, there is no perfect science for where to set that tier cutoff. Unfortunately, one of the things that is commonly done is we look at census data to understand on average how many people are there per household. So maybe 2 to 3, 2.5, somewhere in that range. What is an essential amount of usage? You could see anywhere from probably 45 to 65 gallons per person per day, and then have that be your tier cutoff. Some communities will, even if they are at 2.5 persons per household, they'll say we want to expand this to 4 persons per household. And the reason for that is there's potential drawbacks to doing this. There's a lot of times a incorrect correlation with low income and low water consumption. That's not always the case. So we always hear about the little old lady on a fixed income using low amounts of water, but there are certainly customers within your service area who are using disproportionately more water that are also economically disadvantaged. This could be for reasons of overpopulated households, or households that don't have high efficiency fixtures installed, or leaky pipes. So just by nature of the home, they're using more water disproportionately. And by setting the inclining block rate structure, based on the typical, you might be actually hurting those customers. So thinking about potentially expanding that, but there's obviously the more consumption you give at a lower volumetric rate, the more that it pushes the onus on those higher volume customers, and that could somewhat incorporates economically disadvantaged customers, just by proxy, they're using more water consumption. So I know we're running a little bit behind here. I'll get going. Second case study.
Check, about 10 minutes left, Dave.
Thank you. Second rate study we hear very often is maybe a seasonal community who has a huge influx during maybe summer months. Residents and visitors, so maybe some snowbirds, and also a seasonal community with visitors. They're coming during the summer months. They're running into capacity issues with regard to not having enough water over those peak periods. We hear a lot that year-round customers feel like they're subsidizing those customers that are coming for maybe 3 months of the year or something like that. So what can be done about this? We hear a lot, these core initiatives are rate equity. We want to make sure that year-round customers are not subsidizing seasonal customers, and we want to incentivize conservation during those peak periods. Here's an example of just, you can see a significant peak in max daily consumption over those summer months, running into capacity issues, a huge influx of either seasonal residents or seasonal visitors coming and just driving up the need for water, running into capacity issues, and trying to, if there's something we can do from a rate design perspective to incentivize conservation there. Let's skip over this for time. So just quickly, I know I said I wasn't going to get much into cost allocation, but we're focusing more here on those extra capacity costs. So things like pumping, storage, a portion of your distribution costs, electricity. What cost increase of your operating expenses during those peak periods of time? We can do a very high level analysis of identifying those costs and having a portion of them be recovered during a seasonal rate to reflect that peak period. One, this is going to increase the volumetric rate over the period of time where we're trying to incentivize conservation, so sending a higher pricing signal. And two, it's going to allow for a reduction in the volumetric rate during the non-peak periods to mitigate the burden on your year-round residents, because that is also a concern we're hearing here in this community. So in order to do that, we want to identify those peaking related costs, those things like pumping, storage, electricity, portion of your distribution related costs. Fire protection obviously plays into that, but that's completely separate, and unfortunately we don't have time for it. But fire protection costs are very much cost of service generated or justified, and can offset the need for additional rate increases. Some of your peaking costs that you identify are going to be just normal peaking, just on an hourly basis, people getting up in the morning, taking showers, brushing their teeth, flushing toilets, doing dishes. But a lot of those peaking related costs are going to come just seasonal peaking when there's an influx of customers coming to the community. We want to be able to parse those out and then recover those peaking related costs from that seasonal period with a seasonal rate. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So for example, we have a non-seasonal rate. So this would be, maybe January through May, and then pick back up again in September through December. We have the same fixed charge under both non-seasonal rates and seasonal rates, but we have a lower volumetric rate that's $7.65 for those non-seasonal periods, and then it jumps up to $10.25 for the period of time in which there is that seasonal. Now, we have to be very careful here, especially in New England, where the vast majority of utilities, although this is going in the other direction, albeit slowly, are still billing quarterly. And especially if you're on a rolling quarterly basis, it's really hard to identify from a billing system perspective what that seasonal period is. So if it could be June, July, and August, but if you're billing customers on a rolling basis, a third every month or something like that, you could run into periods where there's overlap and it really gets sophisticated. And what consumption are you billing at the non-seasonal rate versus the seasonal rate? It also gets into the issue of trying to incentivize conservation. If you're not sending that pricing signal on a monthly basis during that seasonal period, and you're waiting until 3 months after when it's already done, the customers aren't seeing that bill, and they're not receiving that incentive to, oh, I'm paying more for water at this point in time, I should probably conserve. Some people are going to react to that, some people aren't. We see pretty elasticity of demand with regard to pricing, but it can be a tool in the toolbox. So I would say if you are thinking about this, If you can move to monthly billing, it's certainly going to make the process easier. And if not, just make sure your billing system can handle the quarterly period so that you are appropriately assessing the seasonal rates during the appropriate time period and communicate that to your customers so they're not shocked at why. And this can really, it's putting more of the onus on the backs of those seasonal customers who are peaking and using a lot more water and reducing the impact on those non-seasonal customers who are there year round. And they're using probably a stable amount of consumption all year round. And for their 9 months out of the year that they're not paying that seasonal rate, they're paying less than they would have if this was an annual rate. So again, real quick, rate study process. We identify the financial and pricing objectives. The financial objectives are how much money do we keep in a reserve fund? How much are we trying to reinvest into our infrastructure? The pricing objectives are what's important to us in terms of revenue stability, affordability, conservation, rate equity, identifying those revenue requirements necessary to be able to not only keep up with operations, but and maintain, but improve and sustain. So you're not running into reliability issues, keeping up with that capital improvements plan. So you're keeping up with regulations and the natural life cycle of your assets, designing a rate structure in order to try to accomplish both your financial objectives as well as your ancillary pricing objectives. And then when you tie it all together, just making sure, and the biggest thing here is looking at customer impacts. And I would not just look at one customer impact like a typical residential customer. Do a broader spread look at how is this impacting very low volume customers? How is this impacting seasonal customers versus year-round customers? How is this impacting high volume residential customers, commercial customers? That's going to give you a broader spectrum of viewpoints of how the rates that you're trying to implement are going to impact a variety of customers within your service area, such that you can do some either tinkering with that. You might see a customer impact that you cannot live with. This is not something we can roll out. Or you might see something that you can live with, but you need to go out and do some strong customer outreach to that group of customers, maybe an industrial or non-residential group of customers that are going to be paying disproportionately more than they are today. You might want to get out there in front of them and go talk to them before they hear about it and they have an opportunity to come talk to you. Tell them why you're doing what you're doing, the bettering of the community, have that ability. And so I know we're running behind, so I'm just going to go through these quickly. We can do the best rate study in the world. You can have all the impetus in the world for what you need to do in terms of reinvestment in infrastructure, have all your ducks in a row of justifying it. But if we can't get the decision makers to say yes and the community to support this, it doesn't matter. All that work is in the garbage can. It doesn't matter, and you're right back off where you started. So there are some tips and tricks to being able to help you get to yes or get to that approval process so you can accomplish your financial goals as well as these ancillary goals. Little tongue in cheek here, but would we communicate differently if customers could choose their water service provider? Probably. I think water providers generally can do a better job of communicating to their customers, and not just when they're asking for additional rate increases. Having communication strategies throughout the year, maybe monthly status reports or outreach efforts or quarterly outreach efforts. Tell them what you're working on. The water industry has historically been very much a invisible industry, if you will. If you're driving down the road and you hit a bunch of potholes, or you see a bridge crumbling, very apparent to you. You don't see the infrastructure in the ground that's also crumbling from a water perspective. Customers generally take it for granted, and they just know that when they turn their tap on, that water comes out. And it's not until something catastrophic happens that customers start paying attention. Make them aware of what you're doing on a daily basis, on an annual basis. What projects are you working on? What's all going into the process of getting them water from your water source to their tap? People, I think, just generally talking to my own friends and family members, they're shocked at how much effort goes into that. And it's not surprising to anybody on this call, but I think for the general public, it is pretty shocking. So communicate to them. What are you doing? How are you doing it? Why are you doing it? On how it's going to impact them. And one of the things you can do if you are going through a big rate study and you're making a huge structural change and you need additional revenue to support that financial plan, putting a one-page flyer or a front and back flyer, visualizations, breaking that down into dollars instead of, when you talk about a 10% increase, that sounds really scary, but you might be talking about less than $1 a day or a few bucks, or sorry, less than $1 per month or a few dollars per month or something like that. for your typical residential customer, it sounds a lot less scary. So putting this into visualizations for them in a way that they can just understand what you're doing, why, how, and how it's going to impact them. And finally, if you think you're getting into a very contentious process where the public or the decision makers aren't on board, don't take for my fans of Parks and Rec, don't take the Parks and Rec kind of community approach where you just have a microphone and people get 3 minutes to come up and yell at you. Hold something we refer to as an open house. Have people come, have different sections or stations around the room, have door prizes where you're talking about customer service, you're talking about the projects you're working on, you're talking about the rate structures, talking about financials. People can just bounce around and have actual conversations, have them learn what what you're doing and why, rather than just yell at you for 3 minutes, which I don't think is fun for anybody. Sarah, I see you. All right.
Well, that was great. We really appreciate your time, Dave and Toby, for giving us that wonderful presentation. I think there was a lot packed into that.
Yeah.
I appreciate the Parks and Rec reference at the end. That was funny. So
there's always one. Thanks for being the one, Sarah.
Yeah. So we do want to have time for questions. I just want to head off a couple of the logistical ones right away, which is this webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a copy of that. I will be sharing the slides as well. So you'll get that in an email. And then the other thing I'm going to follow the webinar with is a short survey. And it's going to be geared toward, hopefully you found this information helpful. And we at DES would like to provide additional training and webinars that are of interest. So I'll be looking for suggestions for future topics in that survey. So expect that to come to your email in the next couple of days, and please do respond. You can also, you'll get that from me, so you can reach out to me directly with any comments or things you want to share as well. But again, I want to say thank you to Dave and Toby, and I'd open it up for questions. We have the chat feature, so you can type in your question there, or you can click the raise hand button, which is up near the chat. And while we do questions too, I was also going to provide, maybe I'll put it in the chat, the link to register for our asset management workshop. And I'll just share one more time the agenda that we have coming up for that, because that'll be another opportunity to hear from Dave and Toby. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but again, if people have questions and they want to raise their hand, please do so, or type them in the box. I see one. So I see Jeffrey Dickinson has his hand raised. I'm going to unmute you, and you have to unmute yourself as well, Jeffrey. So you should be unmuted now. Go ahead and unmute yourself to speak, Jeffrey. Should be a microphone button that you can click. Jeffrey, it looks like you might be having trouble unmuting. There's a button that says mic. It should be up near the camera button, and the other buttons like leave the webinar. If you click on that mic button, it should give you the opportunity to speak. I have enabled your ability to unmute yourself. There you are.
Yeah, I had some secondary thing on the company computer. Sorry about that. Just a quick question, because I couldn't input on the chat thing. Again, something with the company computer, I guess. But briefly was mentioned sort of how do you deal with the expenses and such of dealing with a fire suppression? Are there some resources, written resources, some research or other documents we could turn to, or websites? Because that's a very interesting thing that we need to deal with in our water district here in Andover. Just curious on that. It wasn't mentioned much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. When we do these, we typically have entire sessions on kind of miscellaneous charges, and I would categorize fire protection as a miscellaneous charge, albeit a significant one. We barely had, as you could tell, we barely had time to get through that, so it would have been impossible to get through fire protection as well. AWWA's M1 manual, although it might put you to sleep, is a fantastic resource for identifying how to allocate costs, the different components that are associated of your operating expenses, of your revenue requirements that are associated with fire protection, and then how best to recover those fire protection related costs. At a high level, we take the total amount of revenue collected, or that should be collected from fire protection, and then that's distributed to both public and private fire protection. More often than not, we see municipalities, or at least water utilities within municipalities, very hesitant to implement public fire protection charges just because of the political nature associated with them. But they are very much cost justified and can meaningfully offset the need of revenue increases from your retail customers. But certainly the private fire protection, those are typically assessed on a fire line size. So, 4-inch, 2-inch, 6-inch, scaled very much like the fixed charges that I went through earlier on the retail side of things.
Thanks a lot for that lead.
Sure. Thanks for your question, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I would just throw in there, Dave, one additional thought. Having gone through the resetting of fire suppression rates a number of times, very rarely, it's probably the least combative change that we ever go through, especially on commercial customers. That are often, the existing charges are often less than they should be. And quite frankly, they're usually a de minimis cost to the businesses who get the updated charges. So in some ways, it's a little like found revenue, you might say, for some utilities.
And I'll add one more thing, Jeffrey, just to maybe answer your question in a different way. The M1 manual is going to give you the resources necessary to do a very explicit cost allocation. There are high-level ways that you can identify, a reasonable proxy for the percentage of your net revenues that should be collected from fire protection. I would look at what is commonly, if you type into a Google search, the main PUC curve. That's probably going to pop something up. I can get your email and connect with you and kind of give you a little bit of resource there as well. That's going to give you just a very quick and dirty, probably with details that you have at your fingertips. You can have a reasonable percentage of a reasonable representation of how much revenue you should be generating from fire protection, and then quickly identify how much should be coming from public versus private within that. It's a much easier process to go through, much less data intensive, and probably good enough for what you need to do.
Cool. I'll ping you after this. Thank you.
Sure.
I see a question in the chat. So I'm going to read it for you guys, but know that you can look at it in the chat too if you want to. So this is from Eric Toledo. I like very much the models that you were referring to for municipalities and medium-sized and large systems. However, there are a lot of very small systems like water associations or cooperatives that have no meters, need substantial capital improvements, and running by volunteers that are not trained on good accounting practices. Do you have models that could be useful for these very small utilities? And the cooperatives that he's referring to, those are typically mobile home cooperatives that we see in a lot of in New Hampshire. The residents band together to purchase mobile home cooperatives, and they have, a board made up of residents there that, like Eric is saying, don't have a lot of training. They don't have a lot of the resources and time to be able to do some of this. So do you have any specific resources for those really, really small systems?
Toby, jump in if you want to. I'm just thinking here.
My general thought is, that there's nothing terribly, a standard spreadsheet that actually allocates out some of the costs is perfectly suitable for very small systems. My general thought would be making sure, one of the biggest challenges I would think for very small systems is just making sure you have good capital numbers that you're building into your capital plan. Because honestly, if you don't get the numerator right on a lot of these things, however you end up using rates to, allocate the needed revenues, if you aren't generating enough revenue, it is a challenge. I think in some ways that's an engineering question a little bit more as far as identifying the capital needs. And I don't have a tool that would do that super succinctly for a small utility. I'm sorry.
I'll answer this question another way, just based on how I perceived it. A lot of the financial planning models and the rate design that financial planning models that Toby presented up on the screen on some of the slides, and the rate design that I was talking about, you're right, Eric, are maybe a little too sophisticated for a very small system like you're talking about. But the general premise of the financial plan, it doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be a singular spreadsheet or literally like a single sheet in an Excel workbook that does some high-level analyses. We've spoken with Sarah and DES before about trying to develop. Raftelis does very well from the industry. We like to give back as much as we can, trying to see if we could develop some, a very high level model that can be distributed out and be able to give that financial planning, at least a framework, as well as different resources that are hopefully very accessible for their volunteers who are not trained in accounting that can, easily understand. I think the hardest thing, that's not the hard part to me. That's the easy part to me. The hard part is recovering the costs that you need to based on a very, very small customer base. With no meters, for example, you're looking at fixed charges associated with that. How do you recover the revenue that you need, even if you can identify, which again, I think is the maybe not easy part, but the easier part of the solution. How do you recover that from a very, very small customer base when there's very limited economies of scale? And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that.
Yeah, and that is something, DES does recognize we have these small systems and we want to be able to provide things to them to be able to help them. So I'll mention to Jaren, who introduced herself, she works in the Wastewater Engineering Bureau. She's able to offer assistance to communities and, particularly those small ones that maybe don't have somebody who's financially literate or, comfortable with that world. Her assistance might be useful there, again, on the wastewater side. And then I know there is, Eric, I know you're familiar with the, I think it's the small water system business plan that the Drinking Water Groundwater Bureau has, which is a spreadsheet model that kind of helps walk a community through some of those, the thought process and some of the numbers that they have to have together. But again, it is a challenge and we do recognize that. I do see another question, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. Let's see. All right. And I see Katie's putting the link to the document I was just referring to, so that's great. Most systems are likely undervaluing fire protection and, oh, this is a comment, not a question, by the way. Most systems are likely undervaluing fire protection and setting fees that are not providing near enough cost recovery driven by capacity and delivery. In Plymouth's case, Maine PUC recommended greater than 40% recovery and private fire protection customers were less than 10%. We found a balance between affordability and true cost for service. Very defensible and little pushback from public and commercial and institutional customers. So that was Jason Randall providing that comment. Anything to add on that, Dave or Toby?
No, I think he actually reiterated some of what Dave said, and one of my thoughts, which is generally speaking, as long as you have your backup, changes in fire suppression fees are generally not a huge point of contention oftentimes.
Great.
Yeah, and if you're moving from a system where you have very low fire protection charges or potentially no fire protection charges at all, to move right to, what you're justified from a cost of service perspective, whether you go through the very detailed cost allocations of the M1 manual, or you go through the high level Maine PUC curve that Jason referenced, moving straight to your full cost justification might be too much of a jump. And so you would see some, potentially some smoothing or building up into that just to mitigate the impacts on customers. But it depends on where you are. But again, it's a very justifiable mechanism for recovering additional revenue that doesn't have to come from your retail customers. If you don't have any fire protection at all, for most systems, you have incurred significant costs associated with being able to respond to a fire event, and you're still, like, on an annual basis, you're incurring costs. And so recovering that from your residential customer base, especially if there are businesses, non-residential customers who have a fire suppression system, those residents that don't, they're subsidizing those larger non-residential customers who are benefiting. They're getting lower insurance rates by having a strong fire protection policy in hand.
Great. Thanks for the comments. Again, if anyone has a question, put it in the chat box or raise your hand. Otherwise, I was going to ask one. So I wanted to ask about connection charges. So on either the drinking water side or the wastewater side when you have a new customer connecting. I guess, could you maybe talk a little bit about some considerations that a utility might think about there, or how they might set those or adjust them in the future depending on what they're looking at, and see if there was a way to make them a greater revenue stream from those connection charges?
Sure. Toby, I'll go first and you jump in. Anything I missed,
Sure.
or anything you disagree with, you're allowed to do that too. Connection charges. When I think of a connection charge, I think of just the cost of physically connecting a new customer to the system. What I think is referred to as a connection charge a lot in the industry is both a combination of that, the physical cost of connecting a customer system, and maybe some soft costs of permitting and the time associated with it, but also the capacity costs, which are a lot of times referred to as a system development charge or an impact fee or a capacity charge. That is a new customer to the system buying into the infrastructure that the existing ratepayers have been paying since the beginning of that utility. There are, all the infrastructure in the ground, ratepayers have been paying that off over that period of time, and it's a new customer coming in and buying into the capacity or contributing their fair share of being able to take advantage of those assets that ratepayers that have come before them have paid for. A lot of times, those two components, the actual physical cost of connection and the capacity of the system development charge, are just combined into one. The one thing I will say, Sarah, to just if people are interested in this, I think we could give like a lunch and learn session entirety on it. But I will say these charges should not be done just willy-nilly, just because, community X nearby me charges $4,500 for a residential unit, we're going to charge $4,500 too. That is not a strong impetus. You might be fine, but if a new developer comes in and sues you and your only rationale is, the community next to me is doing it, you're going to lose that lawsuit. These charges can be very heavily litigious. We've seen them be litigious, and you have to have a strong rationale and a rational nexus behind what you're charging a new customer or a completely redeveloped customer, and what your actual investment in the system is. So I can go into more detail if you want, but and those revenues really should be used to then offset future capital investment or existing debt service that has been incurred to pay for those assets. Those revenues that you're getting from system development charges or connection fees, whatever you want to call them, should not be used to offset your operating expenses in any one given year, because they're going to dry up. Legally, they shouldn't be, but also it's just leading to poor financial practices going forward. We've seen this a few instances where communities taken in a bunch of money from connection fees and just use that to mitigate the increases that they should have been having of their rates to support increases in operating expenses. And they get to a point where they ran out of money. Now they need a 50 to 100% rate increase because that money completely dried up.
Right.
Good points.
Yeah. So I would just throw in, this is actually another great, Sarah, this is another great rationale for utilities to actually have a pretty good idea of what their asset management program looks like, because part of what comes out of that actually will be a catalog of assets, which can form the basis of what Dave was talking about, which is really, the utility owns a bunch of stuff that was paid for by all of the existing customers, and sort of the equity approach that he's speaking of. The idea is, we're going to get the new customer basically up to parity on the current value of the installed asset base with all of the other customers. And, it can be a pretty sizable charge. So it is something that, as Dave alluded to, needs to be based on real information. And the asset management plan can provide some of that. And then especially, I love Dave's add-on in the end. It's really important not to have those end up paying for O&M costs. I'm a bit older than Dave, so I remember acutely what happened to some of the utilities in some of the boom areas back when the housing bust hit in 2010. And there were lots of utilities that had become heavily dependent on connection fees to subsidize operation costs. And when those went away, the rate adjustments that were needed just to be able to fund operations were enormous. So just a agreement with Dave on that one.
Well, thank you for that insight. I think that's helpful information, and I agree we could have a whole session on it. We'll have to end it here because we're out of time, and I want to be respectful of everybody who did join us for the call. And, I appreciate very much Dave and Toby. Thank you for giving us that wonderful presentation. I'll encourage everybody again to attend our asset management workshop. The link should be in the chat for you to register if you're interested in that. And again, look for a survey coming from me with some questions about what topics might be of interest in the future related to this overall financial topic. So again, thank you, everybody, and we'll leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Sarah, thanks to you and everybody at DS. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.